Hi everyone. So if you're a chess player, you face 1e4 regularly in your games, and there are many ways for black to play with tons and tons of theory. But today I'm going to suggest a very interesting system for black, which I am personally going to term the Binod of all openings, because this opening does not make any sense. But basically you are putting your opponent on a leash and slowly pulling him in, and at some point you're going to land the final blow and your opponent would not even know what hit him. So let's have a look at this interesting opening. Hey everybody, so we're back and now we're going to look at the opening for today, and this is basically going to be the Alekhines defense, and this is a very provocative opening. You can see it's pushing, it's almost tempting white to push the pawn to e5, and after knight d5 there are many systems for white. One of them actually goes c4, knight b6, c5, knight d5, and now d4, and this feels like a very intense mistake by black, because first of all white has a strong pawn center. The only piece developed for black is the knight on d5, which can be exchanged at any point with knight c3, and this just feels like a big mistake by white. It's almost as if he has given white free moves, and actually that is not the case. Here black has the move d6, and if white had developed a few of his pieces, let's say the knight was on f3 or the bishop was on d3, then it would be a different story. But in the current circumstance, black is breaking through these pawn structures, and it's very difficult for white to maintain this center, let's say. And another system for white here is to simply play d4, and now after d6 to play c4. But after knight b6, you can see the pawn on e5 is again a bit stretched, and after knight f3, black continues putting the pressure with bishop g4, and now it's very difficult for white to maintain this, and usually white has to actually capture, and both c takes d6 and e takes d6 are decent options for black. Now when I played this game, I had not really prepared for a long while at all. I just saw what my opponent plays, and I kind of thought this would be a decent weapon against him, and especially against people who are very over ambitious, and you can try to convince them that they have something in the position and they have to take advantage of it, and once they have overstretched, you can hit back with a counter blow and try to win the game for yourself. Now I did make a mistake in this game, but even then I managed to win, and that only tells you the power of the Alekhine defense. So my opponent played d4, d6, and knight f3. Now this is the main line against this system, and after takes I played the move c6. Now this idea of this system is that black would like to play knight d7 and exchange these two knights, but let's say immediate knight d7 gives white the option of knight takes f7, king takes f7, and queen h5, and now black has to play king e6 to protect the knight, and this looks very risky. The king on e6 does not look comfortable at all, so this is not done. So black plays c6 to protect this knight on d5, and now he will play the knight to d7 at some point and try to exchange the only trump white has in this position. So now white plays bishop e2. There are many systems for white here, but somehow they all kind of lead to similar positions. White could play bishop c4, he could play c4, he could play many systems, but let's kind of focus on bishop e2. Now bishop f5. So black would ideally like to close the pawn structure by playing e6 and then develop these bishop and this knight, but then the bishop on c8 would have been locked in, so he tries to develop this bishop first, and now he can play e6 and try to kind of move his pieces. So white castles, and now knight d7. Finally black is ready to challenge white's active knight on e5. The best move for white here is knight f3, which kind of tells black that my knight on f3 is better than your knight on d7, and I'm going to later on wait and then maybe at some point play knight e5 back when you decide to move the knight on d7. But and of course white has the option of c4 as well, pushing this knight back as well. but this is not too threatening for black, and black has decent systems to play against this. In the game my opponent played bishop g4. He was obviously surprised by my opening choice, as I had never played this before in any game. And here I just took on g4 and then took on e5, and now white has the threat of e6, so you have to either play e6 yourself, which is okay, but somehow it just gives white some attacking chances. You can imagine him playing c4, then kind of playing bishop g5, and then if black were to play g6, then even h4, h5, and he would have the better chances for sure. Especially it's not so easy to develop this bishop on f8 because the pawn on g7 is hanging. So I decided to just play queen d7 here, and now I'm kind of asking him to exchange queens. Now he had this option, but if he takes, even though there is compensation for white, it's nothing more than compensation, and black should equalize even in this case. So he in turn took on d7 and played rook d1 with the idea of c4 to pin the knight, and now black's most logical move looks like king c7, but now white plays e6, which is a very interesting pawn sacrifice, and once black captures c4, knight b6 and bishop f4, and now you can see how black's king is stuck, and after b3 all black's pieces are struck. So after rook d1 I decided to simply play the move king e6. So the king has started a journey from e8 to d7 and now d7 to e6, getting out of any pin on the d file, and now he's going to try and develop his pieces. So c4, knight b6 and b3. Now I played the move g6 because king takes e5 and a4, and suddenly black's pieces are not developed and white is already having a great initiative. So I tried to develop my pieces first. G6, bishop b2, bishop g7, knight d2, and here bishop e5 does not work because of rook e1, f6 and f4. So I played king f5, getting out of the e file, and now in some cases I'm threatening to take on e5. My opponent played knight f1. Maybe knight f3 was a better move to kind of just protect the pawn, let's say, but after king f5, knight f1. Now here is the position where I hesitated kind of. I should have continued with my plan. If you have a plan, follow it. I should have captured the pawn on e5. Now this was my idea, but once I reached this position I kind of realized that there's an interesting idea for white, and I kind of got scared a little bit, but I think it was the best try for black, and black pretty much equalizes immediately. So I played g5. However, after bishop e5, knight g3, king f6, knight e4, and king f5. Now g4 is the move I was afraid of because it forces king f4, and it looks very scary because the king is a kind of on entering your opponent's territory alone, but somehow because all of white's pieces are hanging and the bishop is also protected and there is no easy way to take advantage of the black king, this is actually very good for black. I just kind of got a little bit scared and I kind of took the safer path. G5, so I kind of prevent any sort of protecting of the pawn with f4, and now knight g3, king g6. I also prepared a square for the king on g6 where it is very, very safe. However, now the pawn on e5 is much more stable. Knight e4, rook d8, challenging the rook on the open file, knight c5. Now this is a good move to try to attack the weakness on b7, and I took on d1, and now I played king f5. If I play rook b8, then a4, and this knight will soon be displaced, and then the rook will enter to d7 and white will be winning. So I have to go for counterplay, and I played the move king f5 here. So I'm trying to trade the b7 pawn for the e5 pawn, but now white plays a good move, and that is a4. So he again wants to displace the knight and is not really going for the b7 pawn directly, and only after I play a5, now he plays bishop c3, and once I play h5, he takes on b7. Now bishop takes, and now bishop takes. So now you can see white has two extra pawns on the queen side, and these are very, very dangerous. Black has one extra pawn, but somehow these are not far advanced, and especially the knight on b6 looks very stupid. Now this is definitely better for white, and here black played the move knight b6. Well, I wanted to kind of get this knight into play. And now I leave the choice to you. It is white to play. I ask you to pause the video and think for a while what should white play here? As a hint, there is only one clear way for white to get a much better position where he would have amazing winning chances. If you do not play that move, then black is back in the game, and this will try to help you figure out how difficult it was for white to kind of find the best move. It's your move, white to play. Okay, so here the only convincing move for white was bishop to e1. So basically you are removing the bishop from the attack, you're helping your pawns get the path towards pushing towards the queening square, and you're also keeping the file of the rook open. So this is the best move for white, and this actually leads to a very good position for white, and it will be very difficult for me to come back into the game after this. But of course, I had the simple equalizing move, bishop takes e5 in the opening. I just could not calculate everything over the board, and chess is a game of mistakes, and this is what my opponent made as well. And now I played the move, basically after my opponent played the move b4, which is a mistake because it kind of traps his own bishop here. I played knight d6, trying to bring my pieces into play, and if he were to capture, I capture with the pawn, and now the bishop on a5 is basically stuck on a5 for the remainder of the game. So I played knight d8, and now I played the move c5, again kind of trying to break his pawn structure, and he plays knight c6, I take on c4, he takes on e7, king e6, and now black's pieces are amazingly well placed. The knight, the bishop, the king, the rook, all are perfectly placed, and after something like knight c6, I took on e5. Now c takes b4 would have led to an equal position, takes, but I already realized that black had some winning chances here, so I kind of played knight takes a5, b takes a5, and now simply rook a6, knight d8 and king e7, and the knight on d8 is kind of trapped. After knight b7, c4, so trying to push the black pawn to the queening square, and now you realize that it's actually the black pawn on c4 that is much more dangerous than white's two pawns on the a file. Rook d5, f6, rook c5, and now c3, pushing the pawn further, and now he plays g3. Rook a7, the knight is trapped, so the only move for white is to kind of play a6 and gain a move to save the knight. Rook takes a6, rook c4, protecting the pawn on a4, and now here I made a mistake. I realized that rook a7 was simply winning, but I thought rook b6 would also do the job, but I simply missed knight a5 for some reason. We are both low on time, so this can happen over the board sometimes. And now I played rook b1, king g2, and rook c1. Now my opponent has to go for the rook endgame, that gives him the best chances. And after a5, king d5, rook c8, king d4, a6. And after the move rook a1, rook d8, king c4, this is white to play. I'm again going to ask you to pause the video and try to think, what is the only saving move for white here? This is white to play and draw the position. So here, white should have played the move rook a8. Now this is the only move that draws the game. c2, a7, and after e4, rook c8, king d3, rook d8, king e2, rook c8. You see, it's not easy for black to kind of do anything here because the pawn is already on a7, and he cannot really push the pawn because white would just take, and black cannot really capture here because white would queen. So this would lead to a draw where there is nothing better than repetition for black. Black can of course try some tricks like e3, but I think this is just a draw. So my opponent of course was under time pressure, and so was I, so this was not so easy for both of us. He tried the typical technique of giving checks, and after a few checks, king d2, rook d8, king c1, and now the difference is that after rook d6, the pawn is only on a6 and not on a7. This creates a huge difference. After king f3, king b2, black threatens the queen. Rook b6, king c3, rook c6, king d2, now king e4, rook d6, king e1. Already there is no defense for white, so he plays king e4, just a desperate attempt, but after just queening, takes, king takes, g4, king f5, king e2, king g5, and just rook c5. Next, black will capture this pawn, he will place the rook on a5 and also capture this. White realized he was completely lost, just a rook down, and he resigned the game. This is a very interesting system, and I feel Alekhine defense is a very dynamic opening. It can catch your opponent by surprise. Of course, you also have to be prepared a little bit, but it's a very tempting opening where you're trying to convince your opponent kind of that there is something for him. He has to try and punish you, but actually there's no clear way to punish, and it is a very sound system. White only has one advantage, that is a bit of space, but with proper piece play, black can comfortably equalize and also try to push with some amazing counterplay, because white will probably have his pawns in the center on d4 and c4, and then you can try to create counterplay against these pawns. And in this game, you saw how the knight on f6 that basically escaped on the first move, one knight f6 was played, was the piece that finally got to d6, and then he kind of captured on c4 and basically kind of helped black win the game after he captured on a5. So he was the real Binod whom everybody was searching for, and he was the hero we do not deserve. So I hope you enjoyed the game, and if you did, do like and subscribe and check out other content on the channel. We have plenty of interesting videos to choose from, and do take care.